Time we will get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Jody Wilson. I'm the Certification Director for CSWA, and our webinar topic today is preparing the vineyard for winter. And I'll just show you a quick overview of our speakers. I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of our new resources here at CSWA, some of which are relevant to today's topic and erosion control and winterization. And then Rich Casale, a conservation specialist from NRCS, is going to talk about some best practices in preparing the vineyard for winter. And after that, Peter Wagner and his wife Harrieth, owners of Ormsby Trail Vineyard in Santa Cruz Mountains, will be speaking about their best practices and some of the challenges at their vineyard. And then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. So the first resource I wanted to talk about, or the main resource today, is the CSWA Climate Action Toolkit. This was thanks to a 3-year grant project that we had through CDFA, and it's been a great opportunity to help the industry, no matter where they are in their climate action journey, have a way to kind of assess where they are, look at their top priorities for action planning and implement. And then throughout each of the topics covered, there's also guides, templates, tools, and how-to guides. I just wanted to highlight a few of the Vineyard resources. So the different topics covered is adaptation, kind of looking at site selection and rootstock and canopy management to regulate temperature and some of the different strategies there with an increasing climate. And then soil health and carbon sequestration. Many of the topics are probably familiar to you, such as cover cropping, reduced tillage, and those kind of things, hedgerows. And then it also covers drought resiliency, water conservation. We also have a lot of dry farming resources if you're in an area that is amenable to that. And then energy efficiency and renewables as well. So it's a really great free tool. I encourage you to check it out. You can play around in there and see what it has to offer. And then we have our CSWA resource library. You can type in any topic into the resource library, and a number of resources will come up from videos and case studies, a lot of which are new thanks to our recent grant projects. And then we have a really interesting dry farming grant project that just wrapped up, and we have a lot of great resources there, including a suitability map to see, based on your soil and where you are and your rainfall, if dry farming is an option for you. So I encourage you to check that out as well. And then after this webinar, Rich prepared a number of really helpful resources that I'll share with everybody. And then now I'd like to pass it over to Rich. I'll let Rich go into more about his background, but we've worked with Rich for a long time, and I've had the pleasure of seeing him speak many times. He really is an expert in erosion control and conservation management. He's worked with USDA and NRCS for over 50 years, and also has his own ranch, so he's able to practice some of these winterization tactics that he'll be talking about today. So, Rich, I'll hand it over to you. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
And okay, there we go. And just bear with us while we pass over the controls. Here we go. Okay, we can see your slides.
We have full screen now,
Yep, looks great.
so we can start. Okay, great. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy you could join us on this webinar today in preparation for what might become a serious El Nino winter. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jody and the staff at CSWA for organizing this webinar and the invitation to speak. I'd also like to thank Peter and Harriet Wagner for joining me today to share their experiences as growers with you. I firmly believe in being penny wise and not pound foolish. After all, prevention is the purest form of natural resource stewardship. Being prepared saves us money that otherwise would be spent on costly damages and protects our vineyard properties and natural resources at the same time. I commend each and every one of you for thinking ahead and for being prepared for what winter might bring. One thing I've seen over and over again in my over half century of work in erosion control field are unprepared landowners waiting until it's too late to prevent damage to their properties from storms or wildfire for that matter, then adding insult to injury by installing do-it-yourself emergency practices that end up making the situation worse, causing other problems, or providing a false sense of security. I'm hoping that this webinar will better prepare you and your vineyard for the upcoming winter by preventing problems before they occur. Thanks again for tuning in. But before I begin my presentation, I wanted to give you a little background on myself and my experience working with landowners and or operators such as yourselves. I've spent over 52 years working for USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, as a natural resource conservationist, mostly in the Monterey Bay area until 2017, and then as an NRCS post-wildfire and storm damage restoration specialist, helping and assisting California communities and property owners recover from devastating wildfires and storm events. Over all those years, I've assisted thousands of land users with land management needs on all types of land, including vineyards. I've spoken at landowner workshops and professional conferences throughout my career and authored numerous technical articles and publications, including a 62-page post-wildfire restoration guide for NRCS. I'm a certified professional in erosion and sediment control, an international certification I co-founded in 1981. I'm also a graduate of Humboldt State University with a bachelor degree in natural resource management. My wife and I also own and operate a small ranch in Santa Cruz County where I practice land management and winter preparedness firsthand. So from personal experiences and from all the work that I've done throughout California and the Monterey Bay Area over all those years, I'm happy to be here to share with you some of my experiences and some do's and don'ts as we go along. I'm going to allow probably about no more than 25 minutes. I want to give Harriet and Peter a chance to speak as well in time at the end for questions. So here we go. So an overview of preparing vineyards for winter. Talking about some vineyard erosion prevention strategies. I mentioned that I was certified in erosion and sediment control, but I always like to think of myself as an erosion prevention specialist first, and not an after the fact erosion control specialist. So we'll talk about some prevention strategies. We'll talk about some planning considerations, what I think are the three most important practices to implement and to manage in vineyard operations, some of the most common mistakes, and then some take-home points. So some of the strategies can be broken down into these 5 categories: a management strategy, a vegetative strategy, a structural strategy, a temporary and emergency strategy, and then a combination of 2 or more of those strategies. So we have several different strategies to work from, but I like to use them in this order. And usually this is cheapest to most expensive as well. So keep that in mind as we go forward here. So some planning considerations before installing erosion control practices is that we want to work with nature and to respect natural drainage and runoff patterns. We want to respect the natural processes that are in place. We want to work with nature, not against nature. And when we do that, we can have more effective and generally less expensive solutions. In some cases, there's no solution at all. And that no solution at all is a best management practice that I like to call nature. And so when we know that there is a natural process in place, we have to know where we are in that natural process before we start throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the landscape. We want to maintain as much existing vegetation that we can, especially around vineyards. Runoff and erosion issues, just like wildfire, do not respect property boundaries. So in order to get to the root of issues and to prevent issues from occurring, a lot of times we have to work outside of the vineyard blocks, sometimes outside the property owners, and many times working with neighbors or others that are adjacent to our properties. We need to try and keep runoff and sheet flow whenever possible. I realize that's not always possible because sometimes we inherit situations with a lot of drains and culverts and what have you. But where we do have the option, keeping water that flows over the landscape in sheet flow whenever possible, we're generally ahead of the curve. Keeping in mind, when you control water, you control nature, and that usually doesn't end well. Some other planning considerations. Consider the management and vegetative practices first. They're the easiest, the cheapest, and the longest term with the less maintenance. Structural solutions have a definite downside. They're expensive, they have a design capacity, a life expectancy, they require maintenance, they normally require some kind of a backup practice. They can provide a false sense of security. And almost most importantly, when they fail sometimes catastrophically. So practices I've found over the years work best together. Use a complement of practices and strategies that address the entire vineyard as an ecosystem rather than singling out issues and addressing individually. So be careful with those emergency and temporary practices, especially the do-it-yourself practices. I mean, there are so-called emergency and temporary practices that professionals such as myself may recommend, letting folks know that they have a high failure rate and can provide a false sense of security. They generally have a low threshold or low design capacity and need constant maintenance. Address erosion issues when they're first detected. Don't wait for them to get worse. And as I said earlier, better yet, prevent them from occurring in the first place. So what I think are the three most important practices when preparing vineyards, these three surface to the top every time when someone asks me, what would you do? What do you think is most important? I think vegetative cover, and if you don't have vegetative cover, some kind of a layer on the soil that protects bare soil from raindrops splash. A single raindrop can hit the soil at about 35 miles an hour and displace soil particles 5 feet in any given direction. So erosion really starts with a single raindrop. So that raindrop hits a piece of gravel, a stick, a stone, a piece of straw mulch, a dead weed, anything but bare soil. It's going to take the energy out of that raindrop. Seeding, and we'll talk in a second, but that seeding and mulching is one of the first most important practices. Second would be runoff and drainage management. As notice, I didn't say control here. That it can be very dangerous to just keep talking about drainage and runoff in a controlled fashion, because we may just be moving a problem, creating a new problem, or making a bigger problem. But we're not careful with how drainage and runoff is managed on the landscape. And actually, grass and mulch can help us manage runoff and drainage as well. And three, access road protection and maintenance. It's amazing how much the access road factors in to the damages that we see every winter on vineyards and other cropland. So if we did nothing else and we concentrated on on access road protection, the layout of it, if there's already drainage facilities in it, how we manage those, how we maintain them, what do we do to improve them. So going back to the first practice of seeding and mulch for soil and slope protection, cover crops are pretty common these days, but just to note that they weren't all created equal and they all can do something different for you in your vineyard, depending what the issues might be. And erosion may not be the issue. It may be that you need a cover crop to provide, more nitrogen in the soil. You might want a cover crop that's more permanent, that you don't have to disc in every year and wait on reseeding. Critical area plantings might be a road seeding, not just seeding areas that are not planted, but any bare soil areas outside the vineyard itself would be considered in a critical area planting. And those plantings wouldn't necessarily be grass. They could also be ground covers and shrub plantings. They might even be hedgerow-like plantings as well. And then mulch. And again, all mulches weren't created equal, and where they're applicable and where they're not applicable, whether or not we put them under vine rows or not, or just between the vines. How deep is a real important factor in laying mulch, and we don't want the mulch to be too deep. And yet part of putting mulch in is for weed control and water retention. But we also don't want to create a fire hazard with mulch and habitat for mice. So seeding mulching can go a long way without incorporating expensive erosion control products. So vineyard covered crops, again, you'd want to determine your goal. Is it erosion control? Is it soil health, weed and insect control? Do we want to invigorate vines, or our vines are plenty invigorated enough, and we're looking for a cover crop that won't, put too much nutrient in our vineyard? We might want to have cover crops for runoff control and drainage, as I mentioned. So determining the grass and legume type and annual or perennial and a method of seeding is important in your cover crop decision and selection. You want to make sure you prepare a seed bed, and you want to plant the seed at appropriate time. I can't tell you how many people said, Rich, it didn't work. Well, when did you plant it? How deep was the seed? Did you put some cover over it if you weren't able to prepare a seed bed? And a lot of the musts were out of that equation. They just threw the seed out and expected it to grow and give them a lush cover. So the seeding can be dependent on irrigation and the timing of the first rains. And some vineyards have the ability to irrigate, plant grass seed in their cover up before the first rains. Monitoring and maintenance of the planting is crucial as well. Some may need fertilization, as I said, some may need irrigation. At some point, mowing or weed and rodent control. This is one resource guide that is a grower's guide that's available through the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. And also NRCS is also a resource, because we provide site-specific advice with no charge. We're not a regulatory agency. We do not have a vested interest because we don't sell anything. We don't do the work. So, we have an assembly, I guess you would say, of different expertises that we can bring out to a vineyard to assess a situation or give you advice. NRCS also administers various farm bill programs, so there is financial assistance available to growers that want to do some of these practices, so you don't have to bear the entire cost. So as I mentioned earlier, the critical area plantings are grasses, shrubs, trees, ground covers outside the vineyard, including access road and unplanted areas, slopes too steep to plant, and it may also include waterway banks and stream banks as well. So mulching, the benefits obviously to protect the seedbed from direct rainfall and runoff and erosion. Sometimes it's used just in the seeding process of establishing a cover crop. But folks do recognize that there are multiple benefits for mulching. Can improve soil organic matter and soil quality. It can improve infiltration in the soil, can improve surface water quality, conserve soil moisture and reduce irrigation water and reduce weed growth. I believe one of the handouts I produced, Jody has and will share with you at the end of the slideshow. In fact, I think there's two related to mulching. So number two in the three most important practices would be runoff and drainage. And this goes all the way back to the winery or to the headquarters or to the barn or to the house, roof runoff management. What a lot of people don't realize that with every 1,600 square feet of rooftop, 1,000 gallons of water is generated with just 1 inch of rainfall. And that water is introduced back onto the landscape. That landscape has to accommodate that water, that extra water. So starting back at some of these roofs is important when we're looking at runoff and drainage around a vineyard. And that management might include harvesting that water. I've worked with several vineyards to actually harvest that water, tank that water, and reintroduce it back into either a drip irrigation system or something to irrigate a hedgerow or for other uses, even for wildfire protection. So vineyard row management, I realize everyone on the call today that has a vineyard probably already has their rows arranged, so you wouldn't be able to, are going to be out there changing the alignment of your rows, but you might be expanding your vineyard, and there may be some new growers on board here that haven't planted yet, where you might have the option to look at vineyard row arrangement for erosion control, as well as having appropriate, exposure for sunlight and drainage and other reasons for the way we set our rows up in a vineyard, and for cultural operations. Cover crops and mulch obviously are going to be helpful to help our runoff and drainage and help to increase infiltration and reduce runoff. Grading and shaping of the soil and how it's done and how it's left going into the rainy season. Grass and rock-lined swales, as the one that you see in this photo, are very helpful on slopes, on grades that get more than 4 or 5%. It's hard to maintain erosion in ditches when they go straight down a hill without having some kind of lining. So grass-lined swales are good for 5 to 7% slope, depending on the grass that's been used and the configuration of the swell. Swells we like to see on steeper slopes as being flat bottomed, not rounded or V-shaped, because those shapes speed the water up and cause more downcutting and erosion. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, access road drainage is a real key and a lion's share of where a lot of extra water comes and is actually introduced in some cases back into the vineyard, causing problems. So following along that line, 3 is the other most common practice that I would recommend that you concentrate on in your, so road seeding, where you don't have road protection by any other means, is another way to protect your roads. Outsloping with cross drains. So outsloping would be honoring the natural lay of the ground. When I talked about working with nature, outsloping is a way of doing that so that the road does not become a channel, doesn't become something that's going to cause water to concentrate and cause problems. Cross drains might be, and barely can see that in this photo, but there's a channel drain, an open top box culvert basically across this roadway where water can drop into it and take the water safely to one side or the other with appropriate outlets. So road ditches and drain outlets are important, but sizing them and lining them where needed and having appropriate outlet protection. Instead of just getting it off the road, again, a lot of the road water might be in a concentrated form. You could cause a gully with that water if you don't do the whole project and create a prepared outlet. So the design and construction is very important. If you're regrading a road, putting in a new road right from the beginning, because a lot of the stuff can be built right into it, and you don't have to be retrofitting something or redoing something later. I've had so many people said, "Gosh, Rich, wish I would have talked to you sooner and not have made my road inslope carrying all the water from my vineyard than to have oriented on a more outsloped orientation." So monitoring maintenance, that's not just before the winter starts. This is continuous throughout the winter when we're talking about preparing vineyards for winter. So roads can be designed and installed to minimize soil disturbances and runoff alteration and erosion issues. So just keep that in mind. So some of the most common mistakes is not treating the issues when they're small. You can see in just this access road, the wheel ruts. The wheel ruts are going to be places where water will concentrate and gully and make this road almost impassable after a few storms. One thing I like to mention to people that have unpaved access road is to try and drive the entire road all the time. Don't drive in the wheel ruts of the vehicle that provided those wheel ruts, before you. Move the vehicle across that roadway, especially after you've graded a road or re-graveled a road. It will last much longer. So the lack of monitoring maintenance is a common mistake. I know it's one of those things where we're crisis driven and we wait for the problem before we do something about it. But stay ahead of that, particularly in this upcoming winter, particularly if El Nino hits us this far north. Disturbing vegetation in soil and or slopes during the winter. So if you do anything, do it before the winter and give those areas protection before winter starts. And then getting bad advice. It's amazing, even from licensed folks out there. I'm not naming names, but even licensed people that have been doing some of this work for years are continuing to give it bad advice. It's well intended, but they're not thinking of it as bad. It's just something that they've been doing, and they maybe have gotten some results with it, and maybe they've just been lucky. But it turns out, in my field, to be awful advice, and we'll show you a few examples of that in a second. So some additional common mistakes are uncontrolled release of runoff, not having a proper outlet for road runoff and culverts that are in place, undersizing the drainage facilities. I always say to think big, not small. If we don't have any other option but to control drainage, we want to make those drainage facilities as large as possible or as feasible. It will help to reduce maintenance. It will cause water to move more slowly, and it will be less erosive. So another common mistake is using the wrong seed mix and or timing of the planting. And we already talked about that, so I won't go into it in any more detail here. So our last few common mistakes are improper use or installation of erosion and sediment control project. Two biggies are straw wattles and jute netting, almost always installed incorrectly. I would say, from my professional opinion and being in the field, being on thousands of properties, probably 75% of the time, even when they're installed by licensed contractors. I have handouts on how these things can be installed and when they're appropriate and when they're not appropriate. And when they're not appropriate, they can make the situation worse or create new problems. Worst of all, they can give you a false sense of security because you're doing something, and so you feel like you've taken care of it for now, when in some cases you've made the situation worse and you're not even aware of it. I've seen people spend tens of thousands of dollars on something that only made the situation worse. They would have been better off if they would have just left it up to nature than to um, put the smoke screen over the landscape. So it's a very common mistake. Like I said, a lot of installers don't do it intentionally. And there are installers after federally declared disasters that I think are doing it intentionally to make a quick buck. And some of the stuff is I've never even seen before. Some ridiculous things. That's a whole nother slideshow. So some take home points to give Peter and Harriet some time here and some time for questions at the end. Just to reiterate, to be prepared early and throughout the winter, keeping bare soil vegetated and or mulched, know the early warning signs that cause erosion so that you can treat and address those things earlier rather than later when it's much less expensive and easier to do. To have a backup plan, and particularly if you have structural practices and particularly if you have drainage control, because these types of practices have a design capacity, and when they design, they generally design badly. So we need to design these structural practices on the landscape, including road culverts and other drains and ditches, with a secondary practice, almost if you will, to design them to fail. So if the water bypasses your structure, if it's a drainage control structure, we're basically managing the erosion control to be minimal rather than catastrophic. So when you do a structural practice, a lot of people think I can walk away from it now. I always say you're married to it once you do a structural project, especially if it does have a design capacity, particularly if it's any kind of a drainage system. To work with nature and to use nature as a best management practice whenever you can. To work with nature, with neighbors. And sometimes that might be the county road department if your vineyard is along a county road. Be very careful with emergency practices. I'm not saying that you can't do them, but get expert advice. Talk to NRCS, if you will, even if over the telephone, and ask our professionals what we think of what you want to do. Or call me or email me. As long as I'm on this earth, I'm available to you by phone or email at no charge. Get expert advice with complex erosion issues. And as I mentioned earlier, it may take a companion of practices to address, and it may not get completely fixed in 1 year, but you'll be on the road to recovery. And remember that NRCS provides free advice. It's confidential. Sometimes it involves even a financial incentives if you qualify. And of course, we're an equal opportunity employer, provider, and lender. So thank you so much for your attention this morning or this afternoon, and all the best.
Thanks, Rich. That was great. And so now I think Peter and Harrieth are going to present. Let me just do a couple of things on here.
I stop sharing and then I can bring their slideshow
Yeah,
up.
or Peter, I think Peter, either way, if you want to try to share. If that doesn't work, then here we go. So while Peter's getting that up, Peter and Harrieth own and operate a small vineyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Their vines are about 12 years old, and they're in an elevation of 2,500 feet with some challenging soil types. So they do an excellent job preventing erosion, and they're going to talk about some of their best practices. And please feel free to add anything I might have missed with your intro. I've lost the video for Peter now. Let's see.
I have it up.
Okay, let's see.
Can you
I
hear
will.
me,
Yeah,
Jody?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah. Well, we have it up on the screen.
Okay. I can't see you talking, but that's okay. All right. And sorry, Rich, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to say that Peter and Harriet have been working with NRCS for, I think, 12 or 13 years now.
Right.
It's been a real pleasure to work with, and it's been fun for me to go back and see the progress on their vineyard. And it's one reason why I asked them to join us today on this webinar. So thanks, Peter and Harriet. Take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rich. First, let me thank Jody for organizing this and setting it up. But these things take a lot more work than you think. So I do appreciate it. And Rich, thank you. You've been a great help to us over the years, and we really appreciate that. We're actually surprised, but honored that you chose to ask us to take part in this because we don't have formal training in erosion prevention, let alone control. So we've learned a lot from you, and we're just going to show a few slides about what we have done, because I think that's the reason you asked us to join you, to show the actual implementation of some of the practices that you've been talking about. Let me say that Harriet's on the screen right now, but she prefers me to do the talking.
Yep.
So I will do the talking in the interest of keeping things going, although I hope I finish on time. So let me start off. The title is Winterization at Ormsby Trail Vineyard, and I want to point out we're at 2,500 feet. We're above Corralitos, which means we're in the southern part of the Santa Cruz Mountains. We get a lot of rain, and I'll be talking about how much we get in just a few minutes. But I think probably the most important starting point is to show the bottom half of this slide, which says that erosion control, which is the theme of this webinar, is really intimately intertwined with all of the other vineyard practices, the viticultural practices, and Rich has already indicated as such. But it isn't a separate project. It's not something that you can just parcel out and say, today it's erosion control, tomorrow we're going to work on the vines, because at the end of the day, it all comes together. Rich gave us this set of issues regarding winter preparedness, which overlap with what I'm showing you, but repetition is good. And one of these is rainfall and temperature monitoring, which we do, and I'll show you a little data on that. And by the way, this is our vineyard in the background. And it talks to some of the points Rich illustrated in his talk, and I'll be coming back to some of those a little later on. We will be talking about the cover crop, of course, and the access road work, and particularly, as Rich indicates here, with runoff considerations. The adjacent native vegetation, which is at the perimeter of the vineyard areas, and some critical area planting, meaning areas that aren't vineyard and aren't natural vegetation, but which are within our property and were graded or prepared for other things and used for other things, but ended up being bare soil when we got into the property, needed some attention before we even got started, and I'll show you that. The runoff control, again, Rich says don't use the word control, use the word management. It's preparatory as much as possible rather than corrective. We have a number of things that we've done, including some line ditches lined with heavy-duty erosion control matting, keeping those ditches from being V-shaped, as Rich said. We do have underground water collection from the roof, which is ducted into a large rock basin with a lot of diffusing, if that's the correct word, scattering capability to slow down water and have it spread out rather than channel into a rut and cause a serious problem. And the same actually with our driveway, because one of the characteristics of our vineyard is, you may be able to pick up in this slide at the top, is there isn't much flat area. This is part of the flattest that you're actually looking at, but the blacktop road on the left is at a significant grade, and the top half of that is at about 20%. So we're talking about fairly severe grade issues, which is, I think, part of why Rich thought of us. So when we think about erosion control, or when we thought about it after Rich asked us to take part, we thought, well, why are we doing this? And the answer may be obvious: erosion management or control as best possible. But we came to realize that a lot of it interacts, as I kind of said in the beginning, with soil health and vine health. And they're interchangeable is the wrong word. They work together. It's a system where if we work towards soil health, we're working towards vine health. The vines have roots. They contribute to erosion control. The soil health is good for the cover crop. That contributes to erosion control. And so it's all a system as opposed to individual parts. And approaching it as a system, meaning you don't just fix one part of a system and expect everything to be fine, has been part of our way of thinking right from the get-go. To us, as we thought about it, after, again, Rich contacted us, there's an important component to the whole problem that we're discussing today of timing, of when. And it turns out that for us, a lot of the management practices that Rich talked about as being important came into play right when the vineyard was established. But it didn't stop then, and it's continued, and it's year-round. It is not just a fall checklist of 5 things to do to just make sure everything's okay over the winter, like draining the water supply, the irrigation, so you don't crack a pipe. I mean, that's kind of trivial, and that's not about erosion control anyway. But the main point is, it's not just a fall checklist. Between the interaction of viticultural practices and erosion control and the fact that we have to do things year-round here, then it becomes, again, in other words, a big system where all parts of it need to be addressed as appropriate for the time of year. Obviously, things like cover crop management is more in the spring and early summer. The viticultural practices are at a different time of year, and so on and so on. So thinking about when to do things, I think, is an important part of this. And we are guided by principles and the need for information. And maybe I should have put at the top rather than at the bottom, minimal terrain disturbance. Rich has already addressed that. But when we started our vineyard, it was brush. Nothing had ever been grown on it by humans before. It was completely natural vegetation. And at 2,500 feet, the soil quality is not that great. Very little organic matter, lots of rocks, very susceptible to erosion because of that. Being in the Santa Cruz Mountains, a lot of rain, so that compounds the problem. And so one of the principles that we adhered to right from the get-go was minimal terrain disturbance. And so we just cleared what we had to, the brush, in order to plant a vineyard, but we did not disturb the contours of the terrain really at all. So that was a critical, what do we call it, a principle that we have lived by. I've been in science all my life, as has Harrieth, and so we are people who live by data. And maybe we have too much data, but we think it's better to have too much than not enough. And I'll show you a little bit of what I mean by that in just a moment. And then not just having data, which we can look at on a computer screen, but walking the vineyard to look for impending problems when they're starting to develop, if they are, or reassuring ourselves that things at that point in time look under control, and then planning whether we need a response, and if that response is something we can do, or we need Rich to guide us on. All of those decisions need to be made more or less in real time as things go on. So it's dumbed down to 3 bullet points, but it's a systematic response to a system issue. We focus on 3 things, which is cover crop and weed management, and they have become intermingled, as probably is the case for most of you, but I'll get to that. Soil and vine health, and thinking explicitly about mitigating erosion to the extent we can. And again, part of a system. These 3 things interact. Good cover crop and weed management, to the extent we can practice it, helps mitigate erosion. It helps with vine health, soil health. Good soil and vine health mitigate erosion. So you can see the loops I'm talking about. And we've been trying to do that. So here's some data. Not a difficult plot. It's a busy plot, but it's simple. It's temperature on the y-axis and days of the year on the x-axis starting January 1. And this particular year is 2025 because 2026 is not complete yet. And what you're looking at in red are the high temperatures each day, and in blue are the low temperatures. And we find that's helpful just not for viticultural management, which is its primary intent, but it gives us a good feeling for what we can expect going forward. Granted, we've got global warming and things are going to systematically change. It does give us a feel for example, we have a huge amount of high frequency variation. We have days of every month that are hot and days of every month that are not hot. And that is part of managing the vineyard in general, of knowing how much to water, how little to water, and that plays into erosion control. The temperatures at the low end are important because preparing for winter is in part related to freezing. And in our particular case, we're fortunate. We get down to 32 degrees, the dotted line. We got down to that 3 or 4 days. That was late January and mid-March of 2025, and only for a day or 2. So it wasn't enough to do freezing damage to irrigation structures or really to vines, and we had very little vine damage. But knowing the pattern and having data helps us plan going forward, thinking, okay, we don't have to focus too much on freezing in all probability for the next winter, but we'll keep it in mind as something should it go south and be a different pattern from previous years. So that's one data set. The other data set that's probably more relevant is about rain. And I've got 3 panels here, and I'll show you the bottom one first. And what you can see here is our annual rainfall on the y-axis in inches in each bar, and the years, the rain year being October 1 through September 30th, as I think everyone knows, starting back in 2008, and then every year since then up to last year, 2025. And you can see a number of things that's helpful to us in planning. One of them is huge variation from 20 inches a year to 90. And it means we've got to be agile. We've got to be prepared. We never know ahead of time. And you can't say that if October's wet, so too will be November, December, January, February, March, April. Not at all the case. It's all over the place. So we just have to know and not have to remember that the rainfall is a very unpredictable thing. Our average is 40 inches a year, but if you look at the last 5 years and add up the gray bars over the last 5 bars, it's actually 250 inches. That's 20 feet, almost 21 feet of rain. That would, I think, keep Rich up at night, is my guess. That's a lot of rain. Here's it plotted out daily. And you can see 2 years, one in green, one in green bars, lines, one in blue dots, just to make them clearly separate from each other. The blue dots are this year so far, so it doesn't complete the 365 days, and the green is from last year, so it is complete. And that gives us a number of bits of information, and all it requires is reading the rain gauge each day, which is a 30-second job. And of particular importance, we think, is the maximal and daily rainfall, which you can see here, once got to 3.5 inches, 3 times got to 2.5 inches, and mostly is 2 inches a day and below. That doesn't break it up per hour, so it doesn't really address how much of a deluge we're getting over a given minute, of course, but it does give us a sense of feeling that we haven't yet been in a situation where we see flooding or that kind of erosion associated with the television news every night that we've been forced to endure in the southeast of this country, where they've had so much rain so quickly that houses have been swept away, cars, people have drowned, and so forth. So keeping this data gives us some sense of what we can expect and how agile, again, we have to be. Next year may be different, but data is better than no data. And then here's the cumulative for the last 3 years. So the top one is 23-24, and it got up to 55 inches almost. The bottom one is 24-25, and it got to just over 40 inches. And now we're at 44 in 25-26 so far. And you can see the patterns, more staircase this year, more gradual in previous years. So the patterns are visibly different. And again, having the data is better than trying to remember. Was it dry 2 weeks ago? Was it not dry? What should we be doing? So that kind of data is simple to obtain as well. And as long as you stay on top of entering it in, it's very quick to plot, and we find that helpful. So going back to the practices that Rich was talking about, at the establishment of the vineyard, which may be behind all of you listening in, the vines and the vine rows, we wanted to follow the natural contours, and the roads and the tracks through the vineyard, we wanted to follow the natural contours. That was the principle Rich was talking about of don't fight Mother Nature, go with it, and nature has contoured the mountains in a particular way, and we shouldn't try and fight that. And I've got here for the roads before and after paving, because we did do some paving recently. I'll get to that. So this is a photo of our vineyard. It's 2,500 feet. It's at the southern end of the Santa Cruz Mountains, looking down on the marine layer, which if it were absent, would be showing you Monterey Bay. And what you can see here is the vineyard, part of the vineyard on the right. The access road at the bottom is the same as the access road on the top, but obviously the difference is we elected to pave it with blacktop on the top. We did that because when we were working the vineyard, no matter which month, we would create ruts. And Rich said, try not to drive in the same ruts every day. And we try that, but it's only a 9-foot wide path, and there's a limit to how much you can avoid previous ruts. And we were definitely damaging the road by driving it and creating ruts that would concentrate the water and therefore go from bad to worse. So we engaged a road surfacing company, and we had a long discussion with them about erosion mitigation, which basically boiled down to sheeting the runoff rather than having the road sloping the wrong way or undulating or concentrating. We left it to them because they said, yes, they know all about this. We trusted them. And what you can see here is before and after 5 years. So the bottom one is the road before paving. The top one is the road a couple of weeks ago, and we paved it 5 years ago. And as I mentioned, in those 5 years since paving, we've had 250 inches of rain. We've done no mitigation/restoration for runoff. And I think you can see there's been no evident erosion damage because they were good enough in their paving, we can't take any credit for it, to angle it, slope it, pave it in a way that maintained that sheeting and lack of concentrating effect, which in retrospect, we think was wonderful. So we are very happy
Peter,
with that.
sorry to
Yes,
interrupt, just maybe a 5-minute time check, okay?
sure, no
Okay.
problem. The cover crop that we've used is perennial rye and rose clover. We chose that right at the beginning. It was hydroseeded right at the beginning. We liked that because it was simple, fairly straightforward. The rye came up earlier in the season, earlier as the rain came, and then the rose clover a little later, so they were quasi-sequential. Weeds have become a huge issue, and what we've been taught by listening to webinars by other people, we have to change our attitude towards weeds, at least partially, and try and control them to some extent, but also embrace their good qualities. And the weeds we've got now, which are mostly like look-alike like dandelions, are bee attractive. The bees love them. And so they're beneficial insects and they do well. The roots of these are helping hold the soil. And so we are trying to manage it without them getting out of control, which is not easy, by mowing at the right times and doing it that way. We're mulching. All of the stuff that we mow gets mulched. We leave the grape leaves at fall for that as well. We do put compost under the vines. That's as much for nutrition as erosion control. We have to admit, and we do that about every 2 years. And the cover crop and the weeds that we chose return by themselves each year with the rain. And so they do come back. And we don't irrigate the cover crop because the irrigation would require sprinklers that will wet the vines and just encourage disease. And so our middle course of action is not to irrigate and just use the vine drip for the vines and let the rest go. So here's another image, and it shows the rye before the clover. And again, this is a part of the vineyard. It's typical of all the other parts, and it's 5 years and 250 inches of rain since we planted that cover crop. So you can see very good control of erosion or management. We do some summer crop and weed trimming, and that provides access. It adds mulch, which we leave. It adds protection against runoff erosion, as Rich said. It reduces the need for irrigation. It insulates the soil, the stuff that's left, against the temperature extremes. It's an alternative to herbicides. It avoids tilling, which we have been told and is a bad thing, disturbs the microorganism ecosystem of the soil. So we have been taught not to till. Leaves the roots by just weed whacking at the top. The roots are intact for next year, so things will come back. Gets rid of unsightly and difficult to navigate irregular weed vegetation, and gets rid of some of the hiding places for the rodents. And as I said, we've come to accept many of the weeds as a legitimate cover crop as long as we maintain them. And here is the evidence of reasonable mulching. All this stuff that you're seeing on the bottom is weed detritus that is now dried out. That is about a 4-inch mulch layer. And you can see that filter, that black conical filter, is buried in mulch as an indicator of the mulch we've got. The critical area planting down the bottom left here is lavender, which is a bee magnet, and that's in an area proximate to the vines. And we put that in. A, we like lavender. B, we like bees. Bees just love it. But it is a leach area that we didn't want to plant vines over. But we didn't want to leave it bare. And these have very strong root systems, and we have absolutely no erosion in those at all. And on the right is allowing the natural vegetation to stay. And these are photos from our vineyard. We do have runoff control of our driveway. You can just see a little bit of it in the photo of the left that's proceeding to a culvert under a roadway. We do line the ditches, top right, and as I said, we've planned and executed a blacktop with expert people who know about water flow. And in summary, I've already shown this slide, so I won't go through it, but this is kind of the why, the when, what we need to be guided, and what we focus on. And I will stop at that point, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Peter and Harriet. That was so informative. I haven't seen any questions come up in the chat, but we are at 5 o'clock. So if you have any questions that come up after this webinar, please feel free to email us, and we would be happy to follow up. I'm going to be following up with resources and some contact information too, as well as a recording of this webinar. So thank you, Peter, Harriet, and Rich. That was great. And thank you to all of the attendees who took the time um, to join us today. I just saw another question about grant opportunities. I can follow up with some of anything I know about as well after this webinar. So thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.